everyone, my name's Paul Cardin. I'm an author. I'm also a Falklands War veteran, and I've got a book out which is called Return to Bomb Alley, The Falklands Deception. As the title suggests, this is about the Falklands War in 1982 and the 40th anniversary is being remembered at the moment. I think the first thing I should say is we should remember all the people who died, over 900, and the thousands who were injured, both physically and mentally. And to focus on the subtitle of the book, it's The Falklands Deception. This refers to the behaviour of Margaret Thatcher and her ministers in the early 1980s, and to set the scene, Britain in 1981 was basically a divided country. Mrs. Thatcher had been elected in 1979 and she was very popular at the start. The first sort of major incident that we had was in April-May 1980, and it was a 6-day siege of the Iranian embassy in London, where a number of hostages were taken, and it was brought to a successful conclusion by Mrs. Thatcher after the SAS were sent in and all the hostages were recovered safely. And at that point she was a very popular Prime Minister, and she only had to go down from there, and that's what happened. She had economic policies which were monetarist, and they were influenced by Milton Friedman and Alan Walters, and they were very unforgiving for the sort of working people, the lower echelons of society. And people started to suffer. Pretty quickly there were 3 million people unemployed. Inflation was at 18%. And in summer of 1981 there were riots across all the major cities in the UK. Mrs. Thatcher raised taxes, which was highly unusual for a Conservative Prime Minister, and hundreds of senior economic people said she was wrong to do that, but she just ignored them. They said this would erode the manufacturing and industrial base of the UK, but she just ploughed on, and when we look back we can see that industry and manufacturing was decimated during all of Mrs. Thatcher's terms, and Mrs. Thatcher's popularity took a tumble. By the end of 1981 her approval rating stood at 23%. Now that's the lowest approval rating on record for any UK Prime Minister. And she became desperate to turn that situation around. As early as 1980, I believe she'd begun to hatch her plan, and it wasn't easy at the time to see what was going on because a blanket was sort of thrown over it. But when we look back we can see that in 1980 she'd set up a secret meeting between her foreign minister Nicholas Ridley and a very senior Argentine minister who was their own deputy foreign minister. And this took place in Switzerland in a hotel, the Hotel de Lac in Geneva, and it was top secret. They even put out a cover story saying that Nicholas Ridley was on holiday with his wife, and they'd gone to do some watercolour paintings by Lake Geneva. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But at that meeting, Nicholas Ridley discussed shared sovereignty of the Falkland Islands and a leaseback deal of 99 years, which would be very similar to the one that occurred in Hong Kong before Hong Kong was eventually handed over in 1997. But this leaseback deal would have involved all flagpoles in the Falkland Islands flying Union Jacks or Union flags along with the Argentinian flag. And the documents are still available now for us to go and have a look at what happened. They never were available in the past. It took 25 years for those documents to come out. So at the time, nobody knew what was going on. But anyway, Nicholas Ridley had to go and take his proposals to the Falkland Islanders back in 80 or 81. And they basically gave him the bum's rush and chased him out of town. And the next thing to happen was Mrs. Thatcher removed all the protections that were afforded to overseas dependencies citizens by amending the British Nationality Act 1981. And what this did was brand thousands of overseas residents, including the Falkland Islands, as foreigners who would never be allowed to settle in the UK. Now, how many people listening to this are thinking I'm making this up? Maybe it doesn't sound like Mrs. Thatcher, does it? Why would she do something like that? These are the questions we've got to ask. If she was nothing else, Mrs. Thatcher was a master political strategist. And when you look at what she was up to in 1980, 1981, it all kind of adds up, because she's sending signals to Argentina, the Argentine junta. They're watching all this, and her next move was defence cuts, sweeping defence cuts, which upset a lot of senior defence officials, admirals, generals, but in particular Admiral Sir Henry Leach, who wrote a letter to Mrs. Thatcher saying, look, we need a navy which is flexible and able to react at the drop of a hat. If you go ahead with these cuts, we'll no longer be in a position to do that. And then he got backed up by Lord Carrington when he said, look, you propose to remove HMS Endurance from its patrolling waters in the South Atlantic. That is a massive mistake, because not only is it a symbol of defence, it's also a political symbol. It shows that the government is devoted to the wishes of the islanders. It shows that the islands are being defended. But Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't listen to either of these people, and Lord Carrington later resigned on the 6th of April 1982, just after the invasion. In Argentina, it was sinking in, this idea that Britain no longer cared about the Falkland Islands, and it was across all the newspapers. There was a cable sent from the British Embassy in Buenos Aires warning Thatcher about this, and that all the newspapers were full of it, and the people who read the newspapers it was sinking in with them as well, with Argentine citizens, that maybe they could get these islands back. And at the top, Galtieri, he took it as a sure sign that any invasion of the islands was likely to be uncontested. Britain were heavily involved with selling arms to the fascist junta in Argentina, and that didn't end until 4 days before the invasion. There were also high-level trade talks going on. They were kind of, Mrs. Thatcher was forging these deals and showing that there would be cooperation with Argentina in the future, which was another sign that they didn't really care about the interests of the Falkland Islanders, and the Falkland Islanders' interests only became paramount after the invasion. It seems to me that this idea of the Falkland Islanders' interest being paramount was an invention, because it seemed to appear from thin air. It was never stated before the invasion. So at that point, the Falkland Islanders' interests were not paramount. And just in summary, history has been written by the victors, rewritten countless times by the government and media, and we have a sort of accepted version of events that becomes less and less questionable as time goes on. I'm not prepared to listen to that. As somebody who went down there and who was involved in some of the major incidents, some of the major naval events that went on down there, I'm not prepared to accept that. I was on HMS Yarmouth. We were only a couple of miles away when HMS Sheffield was hit by an Exocet. We took off, we tried to firefight, but it was pointless in the end. We took off the captain and several members of crew. Later on the day of the landings, HMS Ardent was bombed 17 times, and we were close by again and took off the whole crew. And then much later on in the war, HMS Glamorgan was hit by a land-based Exocet, and those 3 incidents killed about 50 plus men. This was the cost of that war. And when you see Mrs. Thatcher being interviewed on BBC Nationwide,
the boys in our Navy,
when she was on the election trail in 1983,
our boys on our ships,
all that seemed to have been forgotten. She was saying, our boys this, our boys that, and she was currying for votes. She was a very determined lady, but she was also a very twisted character. She didn't seem to have any sympathy for the man who died. And I must say, jumping back to the start of the conflict, I was only 22 years old, but it just didn't add up to me. I'd never heard of the Falkland Islands. Most people, I imagine most citizens of the UK, even if they had heard of them, didn't know where they were. And we were sending 30,000 sailors, soldiers and airmen to go and recover these islands. An island populated by 1,800 people. You could have fitted all of them in the London Palladium with seats to spare. It didn't add up to me. It never did over the last 40 years. And I've got to say, I want to extend a warm thank you to Boris Johnson and Chris Whitty for locking me down in the house 3 times and giving me the opportunity to research and write this book. Thank you, Boris Johnson. Thank you, Chris Whitty.